The relentless escalation, inside the Russia-Ukraine conflict of 2024. February 24, 2022. February 24, 2022. This day will go down in history as the date Russia's brazen invasion of Ukraine shattered the illusion of post-Cold War peace in Europe, igniting a conflict that forever altered the course of modern geopolitics. Fast forward to 2024, and the war in Ukraine has transformed into a relentless nightmare. Putin's unyielding ambition and terrifying tactics have driven this conflict to new, unimaginable heights. And worst of all, the war only seems to be escalating. But what has been fueling this rapid escalation that threatens to plunge the region and possibly the world into further chaos and suffering? In this video, we dive into the chaotic reality of a war that seems destined to spiral out of control. From Russia's devastating airstrikes and brutal northern offensive to Ukraine's fierce counterattacks empowered by a historic $95 billion US aid package, every move intensifies the conflict. How far will Putin go? How much more can Ukraine endure? Time to unravel the strategic gambits and geopolitical maneuvers. You'll discover why this war is far from over and what this means for the future of global stability. When talking about crucial actors in a war, it's customary to consider 2 points of view, those of each of the opposing sides. However, in this instance, we can't properly break down the current escalation in the Russo-Ukrainian war without considering the third party involved, Ukraine's Western allies. But let's start with the single most critical factor in the current escalation: Russia's unrelenting desire to bring Ukraine to its knees, leading the country to adopt a by any means necessary approach to achieving its goals. It's only fair to start here, since these actions dictate the course of the conflict and, thus, the escalation. For the most part, Ukraine and its Western allies are only responding to Russia's aggression and defending Ukraine's sovereignty, making their roles in the escalation reactive rather than proactive. So, what has Russia been doing to escalate the conflict in Ukraine? Well, the better question would certainly be what Russia hasn't been doing. In the first few months of 2024, Russia has escalated its aggressive actions in Ukraine militarily, psychologically, and economically, pushing the conflict to new heights of uncertainty, brutality, and devastation. What has allowed Russia to push the war to a new level was the absence of US military aid, as well as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. US aid to Ukraine was severely limited for the first 4 months of 2024 due to Republican Party opposition to President Joe Biden's $60 billion Ukraine military aid request. The reasons for this opposition can be broadly explained by two GOP positions: 1, that the US has already given enough to Ukraine and needs to help Ukraine find an exit strategy for the war, and 2, that the US borders must first be secured before sending, or as some hardline conservatives put it, wasting any more money overseas. This long and painful battle in the US Congress eventually did end in Ukraine's favor in April 2024, with President Biden signing a $95 billion military aid package, which included $61 billion in aid allocated for Ukraine, as well as $1 billion for Gaza. Immediately after the aid package was signed, Ukraine received $1 billion worth of military assistance, with other installments set to follow in the coming months. But while Ukraine was pleading for life-saving air defense systems, Russia enjoyed its moment of overwhelming air superiority, as one Ukrainian general put it, hammering the country's defensive positions with terrifyingly effective glide bombs. It was a change in fortunes for Russia. Toward the end of 2023, Ukraine boasted a somewhat impressive 73% shoot-down rate of Russian glide bombs, a surprise given its modest air defense systems. Meanwhile, the emergence of a new conflict in the Middle East has diverted international attention and resources away from Ukraine's plight, further complicating efforts to address the escalating crisis. So what did Russia manage to achieve exactly during this window of Ukraine's weakness? First and foremost, it reopened a northern front in May, some 2 years after initially abandoning it due to heavy losses. The new front in question is located in Ukraine's Kharkiv Oblast, an area that has already seen its fair share of intense fighting in this clash. This time around, Russia concentrated a large number of troops around northern Ukraine, primarily focusing on the border region of Kharkiv. According to Ukrainian military commentators Konstantin Mashevitz and Alexander Kovalenko, there were some 2,000 Russian soldiers on the front line, 2,000 in the immediate reserve, and nearly 4,000 expected to arrive. The initial attack took place at 2 points near Kharkiv, the administrative center of the Kharkiv Oblast. The first phase targeted the village of Lipsy, located some 11 miles north of Kharkiv, while the second was bound for Vovkhansk, a city approximately 18.6 miles to the east. Thanks to this somewhat surprising push, Russia managed to claim 9 villages in the first 2 days. Though, to be fair, the force of the push might have been surprising, the push itself certainly wasn't. Some Ukrainian officials warned that Russia had amassed at least 35,000 soldiers north of the border before the initial attack occurred. But a much clearer message came directly from the Russian side, with the country's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, publicly announcing the Kremlin's intention to seize Kharkiv. According to him, this move was part of President Putin's plan to establish a so-called sanitary zone 6 miles into Ukraine, with the goal of protecting Russian settlements near the border. But was this truly the only reason for going after the Kharkiv Oblast? Evidently not. According to President Zelensky, the strikes in the Kharkiv Oblast aimed to stretch the Ukrainian forces and undermine the moral and motivational basis of Ukrainians' ability to defend themselves. In other words, Russia targeted the Kharkiv Oblast to militarily, psychologically, and strategically weaken Ukraine. By targeting Ukraine's second-largest city and industrial center, Russia wanted to spread fear and uncertainty among the Ukrainian population while stretching the military's resources even thinner. This allowed the Russian forces to make at least some gains on the fronts they considered principal Chasiv Yar and Avdiivka, but these gains were rather short-lived. The entire Kharkiv Oblast offensive can be considered short-lived, as Ukraine has mostly managed to restabilize the north by June 2024. This wouldn't have been possible without a groundbreaking policy change made by the country's Western allies. But more on that later. We're still far from listing all the ways Russia has contributed to a rapid escalation of the conflict in Ukraine. Another crucial factor is undoubtedly Russia's plan to launch a major offensive in the summer of 2024, one that could make it one of the bloodiest of the 21st century. Many military experts see this planned offensive as the escalation of all escalations, part of Russia's increasingly more daring moves that have occurred in the past few months. For instance, between March and April alone, Russian attacks increased by 17%, according to the UK Ministry of Defense. Some 3/4 of these attacks were concentrated in the east, suggesting that Russia is prioritizing the conquest of Donetsk and Luhansk, the 2 administrative regions that make up Ukraine's Donbas region. As June 2024 comes to an end, Russia isn't letting up with the attacks in the region, leading some experts to believe that the much-feared summer offensive has already begun. Russian forces started increasing the intensity of their attacks on June 18, focusing on the Toretsk-Horlivka area, southwest of Chasiv Yar and northeast of Avdiivka. This area was hit with another intense wave of attacks between June 19 and June 22, allowing Russia to make several tactical gains in the region. To pull off this dreaded summer offensive, Russia is also expected to draft 300,000 new soldiers by the end of June 2024. However, at the beginning of this month, President Putin stated that there was no need to mobilize any troops as plenty of volunteers joined the Russian military ranks. According to Putin, over 160,000 people have volunteered to join the Russian forces in 2024 alone, after more than 300,000 individuals reportedly did the same the year prior. Even if we take Putin's statements with a grain of salt, which the world always does, it would mean Russia has enough troops to continue the escalation. Given how many troops the country has lost so far, it becomes clear that Putin will truly stop at nothing to achieve his goals, not even sacrificing hundreds of thousands of Russian and foreign volunteer lives. That's why this period of escalation has seen some of the highest casualty rates of the entire war. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Russia has lost 55,160 troops between March 1 and May 1. However, in May alone, the number of lost troops increased by a staggering 38,940, highlighting the intensification of the conflict and the heavy toll it has taken on Russian forces. Though the estimates for June are yet to be released, Russia reportedly lost another 20,000 soldiers by June 18, suggesting that the casualty rate remains alarmingly high. In total, since the beginning of the invasion, over 538,000 Russian soldiers have been killed, all because of a tyrant's relentless pursuit of power. And if Putin is willing to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of his own soldiers, it shouldn't surprise you how little regard he has for Ukrainian lives. And we aren't just talking about the soldiers. We're talking about the civilians as well. Russia's increased willingness to target the civilian population in Ukraine speaks volumes about Putin's ruthless tactics. In May, the civilian death toll in Ukraine rose to 174, the highest level in nearly a year, all thanks to Russia's increased missile and bomb strikes on populated areas near Kharkiv. Compared to April 2024, there has been a 31% increase in civilian casualties. The May victims of Russian atrocities include 12 people who died when 2 glide bombs hit a supermarket in Kharkiv, as well as 3 people including a 12-year-old boy and a 12-year-old girl killed or severely injured when a 5-story apartment block in the region's Novobavorskaya district was shelled. Targeting exclusively civilian infrastructure with no operational value highlights the desperate yet brutal measures Russia is taking to exert pressure on Ukraine. Russia has also been increasingly pressuring Ukraine by launching massive attacks on the country's power grid. Every new grid attack seems to outdo the previous one. They're increasingly labeled the biggest one yet, showcasing the escalating intensity of the conflict. At the time of making this video, the latest of these attacks took place on June 22. This was the 8th time Russia targeted Ukraine's power grid in the past 3 months. This time, Ukraine's air defense system managed to down 12 out of 16 missiles fired and all 13 drones sent by Russia. However, the remaining missiles still managed to do some damage, wounding energy workers and damaging equipment. Since Russia started pummeling Ukraine's energy facilities in late March, it managed to take out half of the country's electricity generating capacity, according to President Zelensky. Though the country started buying energy from the European Union to make up for the shortfall, the intense nature of Russian attacks makes catching up virtually impossible. Of course, the energy crisis only compounds the humanitarian situation, making it even more difficult for Ukrainians to cope with the relentless conflict. And as things currently stand, there's no end in sight. Many experts believe Putin is gearing up for a long-term war, which likely won't stay within Ukraine's borders. So, not only is the war in Ukraine escalating, but its ripple effects could destabilize the entire region, continent, and possibly even the world. But how do we know Putin has an all-out war in mind? It's not from his words. He's often spoken of peace with Ukraine, but we know how little weight his words carry. Unfortunately, Putin's actions speak louder than any words. In May 2024, he removed his longtime confidant, Sergei Shoigu, as Russia's Minister of Defense, a position he held for a mind-blowing 12 years. But this isn't the telling part. It's who Putin replaced Shoigu with that matters. Andrei Belousov, an economist, became the new Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation. But why does an economist like the Minister of Defense equate to a long-term war? Let us explain. Belousov's appointment signals a significant shift in Russia's strategy. An economist at the helm suggests that the Kremlin is gearing up for a protracted conflict, one that requires meticulous resource management and economic endurance. Belousov's expertise is not in battlefield tactics but in sustaining a war economy, ensuring that Russia's military complex can continue to function despite sanctions and economic strain. The Institute for the Study of War, an American non-profit research group, puts it this way: these high-level reshuffles following the Russian presidential election strongly suggest that Putin is taking significant steps towards mobilizing the Russian economy and defense industrial base to support a protracted war in Ukraine and possibly prepare for a future confrontation with NATO. But again, this is nothing Russian officials haven't already been warning us about directly. In March 2024, a senior Russian military officer, Vladimir Zarudnitsky, said, the possibility of an escalation of the conflict in Ukraine from the expansion of participants in proxy forces used for military confrontation with Russia to a large-scale war in Europe cannot be ruled out. But what about NATO, aka the opposing side in this war? What is the alliance doing to prevent the possibility of an all-out war in Europe? Well, NATO is doing all in its power to help Ukraine win, as this is the only way to potentially prevent further escalation in Europe. But paradoxically, the moves made by Ukraine's Western allies with this goal in mind are also contributing to the escalation of the conflict. How so? Well, it's a classic damned if you do and damned if you don't conundrum. At the beginning of the Russian invasion, the Western allies were hesitant to deliver any weapons to Ukraine for fear of escalation and expansion of the war. Months passed before the Biden administration decided to send artillery and precious HIMARS missile systems to Ukraine. Almost a year passed before the country saw its first delivery of modern tanks. This pattern of delays and half measures would continue throughout the war in Ukraine. The Ukrainian military received weapons only after it had already been weakened. Ukraine received a promise that an offensive force would be created to tackle Russia at its weakest only after the Kremlin mobilized an additional 300,000 troops. And Ukraine received a green light to use Western weapons against Russian targets only after Russia had wreaked havoc in Ukraine for months. But even if it comes late in the game, the last move is no less groundbreaking. Before May of 2024, Ukraine was only allowed to use Western-made weapons to strike military targets inside Ukraine, with Crimea and other occupied territories included. At the same time, Russia could strike any part of the Ukrainian territory it wanted, including the civilian targets, without any real pushback from the West other than a few harsh headlines. This situation also allowed Russia to attack Kharkiv in the first place. You see, with no real threat against its troops, Russia was able to concentrate thousands of them near the Ukrainian border. Ukraine, meanwhile, could only watch this happen, hamstrung by restrictions on its use of Western weapons. If Ukraine had been allowed to use these weapons earlier, the concentrations of Russian forces and the subsequent attack on Kharkiv might never have occurred, as most of the staging areas were well within the country's range of fire. But the attack on Kharkiv did happen, and it was this attack that finally prompted Ukraine's Western allies to act more decisively. So, now, Ukraine is allowed to use Western weapons on Russian soil, but only around the Kharkiv Oblast. The Western weapons in question come from nations like the US, the UK, and France, countries known for their advanced military technology and precision weaponry. The US has allowed Ukraine to use American-supplied weapons to hit back at Russian forces hitting them or preparing to hit them, as one US official puts it. However, he adds that the US policy concerning prohibiting the use of Army Tactical Missile System, ATACMS, or long-range strikes inside of Russia has not changed. As for the other nations, France has allowed Ukraine to use its Scalp EG air-launched cruise missiles to hit Russia, while the UK did the same for the nearly identical twin missile Storm Shadow. Within hours of receiving permission, Ukraine was already blowing up Russian supply depots and other military targets left and right. The strikes instantly hampered Russia's war effort, breaking up the troops near the Ukrainian border. This effect has led some military experts to believe that this Western move is actually de-escalating the conflict in Ukraine rather than escalating it further. But the truth is that this action, no matter how warranted, will inevitably cause a Russian reaction. After all, we're talking about Russia, a country that doesn't seem likely to admit defeat. Russia has already accused the US and other NATO countries of provoking a new level of tension by allowing Ukraine to use Western-supplied weapons on its soil. Of course, the country conveniently left out the part where this move was done to protect the civilians living close to the Russian border and counter Russian aggression. This accusation is just another attempt by Russia to deflect blame and portray itself as the victim despite its continued attacks on Ukrainian civilians and infrastructure. To make matters worse, Russia blames NATO for deliberately prolonging the conflict, which is a laughable claim at best. According to the Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, NATO countries are in every possible way provoking Ukraine to continue this senseless war. That's rich coming from Russia, isn't it? The country that has launched the very senseless war in question, leaving behind mass graves and a trail of destruction. Ukraine's Western allies have been so shocked by Russia's actions in Ukraine that there were even talks of deploying NATO soldiers to fight for the country. Now, as you probably know, Ukraine isn't a NATO member, which means the alliance doesn't have the right to send in troops or establish a no-fly zone over the country. However, this didn't stop French President Emmanuel Macron from implying that France might send troops to defend Ukraine. This sentiment was echoed by several European nations, including the Baltic states, which might also find themselves in Russia's path of destruction. The mere fact this idea is even brewing and shared publicly clearly shows that the European nations will do just about anything to stop Russia from winning the war. But then again, sending in NATO troops would likely have the complete opposite effect. It wouldn't stop the conflict in Ukraine, it would only make it bigger, escalating it to an all-out war in Europe. That's why NATO's top officials have dismissed the idea of deploying troops to Ukraine. On June 6, NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg clearly stated, NATO has no plans to deploy forces to Ukraine, as the alliance doesn't see any imminent military threat against any NATO ally. As a result, the European countries have seemingly shifted gears and focused on only sending instructors to train Ukrainian forces. France also leads the race in this regard, with French instructors possibly being sent to Lviv and Kyiv. However, Russia also sees this move as crossing the red line, with Minister Lavrov warning that any instructors sent to Ukraine would be a legitimate target for Russian armed forces. This would make this move another rung climbed on the heated escalation ladder in Ukraine, potentially leading to a more direct military confrontation between NATO and Russia. The same can be said for the F-16 fighter jets Ukraine has finally received after practically begging for them for months on end. The F-16 Fighting Falcon is a U.S.-made single-engine supersonic multi-role fighter aircraft originally developed for the U.S. Air Force. Designed as an air superiority fighter, this jet is expected to give Ukraine a chance to reclaim its skies after months of Russian dominance. Multiple nations have promised to deliver these jets to Ukraine, only for these plans to be repeatedly delayed. But with Russia's major offensive looming on the horizon, Ukraine is expected to finally receive the first batch of these valuable jets in June or July of 2024. Though there have been some reports that the Netherlands has already delivered 24 fighter jets to Ukraine, these jets have yet to be seen flying over Ukraine. But once they do take flight, they will be armed with long-range missiles supplied by the likes of Poland, Slovenia, and Slovakia, countries that have also granted Ukraine permission to use these missiles to hit Russian soil. Missile-armed F-16s will allow the country to target additional military infrastructure, including the Russian airfields that keep on launching attacks into Ukrainian territory. Another viable target will be the Crimean Bridge, which connects mainland Russia to the Crimean Peninsula. If Ukraine managed to disable this bridge, it would significantly disrupt Russia's ability to move troops and supplies into Crimea, potentially giving the country a window of opportunity to win back control over the region. Besides, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, and Norway have pledged to deliver F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. When all the pledges are met, the country should have about 80 of these advanced machines. This would be a monumental boost to Ukraine's current fleet, which mainly consists of MiG-29, Su-24, and Su-25 aircraft. Even before the strain and damage the war had done to these aircraft, they were already outdated and far inferior to the F-16s. The F-16 fighter jets can carry a larger payload of weapons: 2 2,000-pound bombs, 2 AIM-9, 2 AIM-120 air-to-air missiles, and 2 2,400-pound external fuel tanks. These aircraft also have more sophisticated and powerful radar systems and tend to be more pilot-friendly overall. From this description alone, it's obvious why the F-16 jets are expected to be a game-changer for the Ukrainian forces. It's also clear why Russia sees these aircraft as another escalatory step in the conflict that might warrant a devastating response. Then again, Russia sees almost any defensive move on behalf of Ukraine as an escalation, provocation, or aggression. That's how the country justifies many of its military actions, even when it's clear as day that they violate international law or human rights. With this in mind, let's see which Ukrainian moves have been deemed escalatory in the ongoing war. We've already mentioned the biggest one, using Western-supplied weapons to wreak havoc on Russian soil. Thanks to their immense arrogance, the Russian forces did little to conceal, fortify, or protect the supply depots and staging areas near the Ukrainian borders. The result? Russia's $800 million air defense systems going up in flames. The same goes for tons of ammunition, several strategic positions, and the infrastructure Russia needed to threaten Kharkiv. But this move did much more than simply destroy some military resources. It also shattered the illusion Russian soldiers had that they would always be safe on Russian soil, undermining their morale. In addition, Ukraine has also been striking Russian infrastructure, primarily relying on its own missiles and drones. The country has also focused on disabling Russian stations used to identify incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs for short. Now, you might wonder, why would Ukraine waste war efforts on this when it doesn't have any ICBMs of its own? Well, the answer is simple: Ukraine isn't doing it for its own sake. It's doing it to help its Western allies deter Russia from going through with their nuclear threats. You see, it would be quite unwise for Russia to launch a nuclear attack against an opponent if their own defensive systems were at risk of being destroyed. Speaking of a nuclear attack, how likely is Russia to truly launch one? After all, the country has used nuclear blackmail throughout the war in Ukraine to deter Western interference and ensure its strategic advantage. In May 2024, Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko even said that the Russian soldiers have begun to train in tactical nuclear weapons to be deployed on the Ukrainian battlefield. But despite these and many other hints from the Russian side, the actual likelihood of this mother of all escalations remains relatively low. In other words, most experts believe that Russia is only bluffing, seeing nuclear blackmail as its most effective intimidation tactic. But judging by the new, bolder moves made by Ukraine's Western allies, they are no longer allowing Russia to bully them into submission. So, now what? Where can the war in Ukraine go from here? Well, even though Russia hasn't responded to any of the red lines that have been crossed so far, it doesn't mean it won't in the future. Again, we're talking about a nation with a history of bold and surprising moves, especially when it feels its very survival is at stake. If we put aside a resolution to the conflict, potential escalatory scenarios include a direct military confrontation between NATO and Russian forces within Ukraine, a Russian strike killing NATO military personnel within Ukraine, Russia attacking NATO targets outside Ukraine to punish the alliance for any perceived intervention, the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Whatever the trigger might be, the result will probably be the same: a global conflict with a possibly devastating end in sight. But what do you think? Which scenario is the most likely to unfold in Ukraine? And, in your opinion, which move has contributed to the current escalation the most? Share your thoughts and opinions in the comments section below. Now, go check out Why is Putin so desperate for a ceasefire, or click on this other video instead.